Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Shelter Diversion 2.0 training. I am Amber Freeman, the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Today, we have a very full, interesting training for you today. But before we begin, I just want to go over some housekeeping. So because this is a webinar, you all are all muted. But you can type any questions that you have at any time during the questions box, and we will be sure to get to them. At the end, we'll also have a questions and answer segment. We prefer to have these trainings in person, but because we are virtual, we still want to try to make it as interactive as possible. So although we are in webinar format, if you prefer to ask a question yourself, I can unmute you. Just put it in the questions box, or raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. Also, this training is being recorded, and the recording as well as the slides will be available in our webinar library at www.cceh.org. It will also be sent to you after this training so that you can have for your reference. So for today's training, we have Diana Berube, who is our Program Manager for Prevention and Exit Strategies with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Diana is our in-house shelter diversion training and has done shelter diversion 1.0 as well as 2.0. So before we actually get into it, I see from our registration that we have a lot of individuals from different states, from different providers, different organizations. We have some schools, we have some municipalities. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness so you all know exactly what it is that we do. So actually I'm going to ask Diana to give us an overview of CCEh.
Great, thank you, Amber, and thank you all for joining us this morning. CCEh is dedicated to ending homelessness in our state. Our mission is to work with community partners across the state, with our homeless service providers in advocacy, leadership, and building the capacity in the field to respond to all challenges. Our vision is to ensure that all episodes for any household in the state of Connecticut are homeless, are rare, brief, and non-recurring. At CCEh, we have a broad array of roles and functions. We manage our state's homeless database, that is HMIS. We work on training and technical assistance, as you all have joined us today for webinar training. We provide an array of training opportunities that you can find on our website. We have a dedicated staff to advocacy in educating our elected officials on the resources that we need in the state of Connecticut to end homelessness. We work in collaboration, as I said, with our community partners, our homeless service providers, to support their staff and ensure quality of the programs that we provide statewide. Lastly, we do provide some client financial assistance. At CCEh, we work really hard to raise money to fill gaps in emergency resources that frontline workers can access to help their clients. We have a packed agenda for today, and thank you again for joining us. This training is geared more towards providers, but can be beneficial to any of those in the community that are working with folks that are experiencing any level of homelessness. So we're going to dive into what shelter diversion is as a practice, why the work is so important, how we can really work together to do effective shelter diversion, how we put those practices into place. For the providers, this section on diversion appointment workflow is going to be important for you, and then we'll finish off with some resource mapping for your specific communities. So that brings us to the beginning of our presentation, the basics of shelter diversion. And so we like to use this metaphor of a front door, really, that anybody that is on the brink of homelessness or is in a housing instability, that we want to really identify those folks as soon as possible help them avoid any experience of homelessness, and really divert them to a stable housing solution as quickly as possible, so that no one needs to enter emergency shelter or experience any kind of literal homelessness. And we'll talk about what that literal homelessness means. So when you hear the word homeless, it can mean a lot of different things, and people throw that word around. Typically, what you think of when you hear that word is an older gentleman sleeping on the side of the street, holding a cardboard sign, and asking for donations. I apologize, Amber, I seem to have lost the slideshow.
Okay, I was sending it to you to share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for technical difficulties. Give me just a moment. There we go. I think we're all set. Do you see that, Amber? Just checking on your end.
I do not see your screen yet.
Okay. Try again.
Yes, I see the slide. I don't see the HUD document.
Okay, there we go. Hopefully that fixed it. So this is the HUD definition of homelessness, and we wanted to share this with you because the definitions of homelessness are extremely important. As I was saying, typically when we hear the word homeless, we're picturing, or for those of you in the community that haven't had any experience in working with those that are experiencing homelessness, the visual that you have in your head is of someone sleeping on the side of the road, holding a cardboard sign and asking for help. But really, homelessness can encompass many different scenarios. So a literal homelessness might mean that somebody's sleeping in what we call a place that's not meant for human habitation. And these definitions, these guidelines are set by the federal government. So just for your reference, this is where you would go to find those definitions. Imminent homelessness can mean that somebody is about to lose housing within 14 days and may be looking towards either having to enter emergency shelter or sleeping out on the street. Homeless under other federal statutes, we like to make sure that people are aware that under different community partners, these definitions might change a little bit. For instance, under the Department of Education, couch surfing might mean that somebody does qualify under definitions of homelessness. And lastly, fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence can also qualify somebody for specific services under HUD definitions of homelessness. And I will bring back my screen to Amber so we can continue with the presentation. Thank you. And again, we really want to show you why these definitions are important. It seems, you know, from a practical standpoint, to kind of define an individual not as a person, but as a definition of homelessness. We really want to make sure that we are treating each and every individual that touches our system with a level of dignity and respect that every person deserves. But the definitions kind of define where we are in a system of how we can best support and help anybody that's on the brink of homelessness or is experiencing homelessness with the services that can help them exit that as quickly as possible. So this is just a broad overview. And again, this may be a little redundant if you had attended a previous diversion training or diversion 1.0 training, but to give a sense of where we are as a state and how our system works. We have our 211 hotline. That is the front door to anyone experiencing homelessness that is in need of housing services. People will call and have a brief conversation with a 211 call specialist who will help to troubleshoot and problem solve over the phone. If that is unsuccessful, the next phase of our interventions would be a more in-depth CAN appointment assessment. Those happen region-wide, so that people can access the services that are appropriate within their region to assist in resolving their housing crisis as quick as possible. Those appointments can range from anywhere to a half an hour to an hour and a half, but are more in-depth to understand the housing crisis and provide some support. From there, any client might enter emergency shelter if the shelters, which is very, very common, that the shelter beds are full and we don't have space available for somebody. They will be placed on a prioritized wait list for emergency shelter, and then also referred to their local homeless outreach worker, who can then pick up the same problem solving conversations that we would have at the beginning of the 211 phone call, to assist further with referrals to services and make sure that we're exiting, to make sure that those episodes of homelessness are, again, brief and non-recurring. Anyone that enters emergency shelter or is connected with an outreach worker would receive a survey that would put them on what we call our by name list. That is a full and comprehensive list of everyone across the state that is in need of housing interventions. Those housing interventions can range anywhere from a very light touch to full permanent supportive housing with case management, rental assistance, ongoing, as long as the client might need. And so those definitions of homelessness matter within our system, because somebody that is experiencing literal homelessness for a long period of time is going to qualify for different services than somebody who is on the brink of homelessness and maybe just needs that one-time quick assistance. This map here on your screen now is the breakdown of the state of Connecticut. Like I said, our service providers within each region vary. We have emergency shelters that work very closely with us, nonprofits, community partners, and they vary region-wide. So we've broken up our state into 7 what we call coordinated access network regions. Within those regions, when someone calls 211 and is in need of an appointment, they'll get scheduled with a provider within their region. So that brings us to why. Why do we do shelter diversion? Shelter diversion is really important because while emergency shelter might be free to anybody that needs it, and that's hugely important, we have to recognize that it is cost effective to catch somebody at the very front door of homelessness rather than let them flow through our system, which can be more costly to us as a state. So some small mediation, sometimes it's something as simple as a food gift card or a bus ticket, some help with utility bills, or very often for those that are living on the poverty line, saving up for first month and security deposit to sign a new lease. It can be very difficult. So often some assistance can be helped with some rental fees, and that can help exit somebody from their housing crisis very quickly. It's much less expensive than a rapid rehousing program with case management and rental assistance that can last anywhere from 6 months to a year. A shelter stay or a Section 8 subsidy can be very costly to our system, and the homeless response to crisis intervention, including hospitalizations, emergency services, incarceration, all of those things can be very, very expensive to our system. So again, reaching somebody when they first experience the crisis can be very cost effective to us as a system. Homelessness in itself can be a traumatic experience. So even somebody who is in housing crisis and maybe losing their housing within a short period of time is in a traumatic place for themselves, for their family, for their household. Catching families and individuals at the brink of homelessness can reduce negative health outcomes. It can reduce future episodes of homelessness. We know as a state that any experience of homelessness can be a predictor of homelessness in the future. So young children that have to enter shelter are more likely to experience an episode of homelessness later in life. So the importance of really catching people in diversion practices and making sure that we're providing them stability is huge in the trajectory of a child's life that may be experiencing homelessness. I want to give you just a little taste of what an emergency shelter looks like. And this is important in diversion practices and why diversion is so important also, in that in Connecticut, you know, we've got family shelters, we've got individual shelters with dormitory-like settings. So for females and males that are entering shelter individually, this is typically what it's going to look like for you, to share a bunk bed, have very little privacy. There are shelter realities that we like to break some misconceptions about the use of emergency shelter and why it's there, so that we can really make sure that folks have an understanding of what all their options are when they're in housing crisis, to make sure that we're doing the best for each household to provide them services, provide them the help that they need so that they don't have to enter an atmosphere like this. Yes, so the shelter realities, I mean, a lot of people don't, you know, I encourage you in your own community to reach out to your local shelter and ask if you can come and take a tour, understand what the shelter is. In Connecticut, our shelters are low barrier. We really try to make sure that anybody that is in need can access shelter. So what that also means is that our shelters are what we call wet shelters. Folks that are experiencing substance abuse issues are allowed to come in the evening, lay their head down, and receive the services that are necessary to help them resolve their housing crisis. We have a reduction of rules and policies to make sure, again, that it's as low barrier as possible and that anybody that is in need of shelter can access it. From the photo that I just showed you, you understand that there's very little privacy, minimal staffing. The hours that are available to folks oftentimes are to lay your head in the evening and sleep. So you may be able to enter shelter in the evening, but have to leave first thing in the morning. So where do people go during the day? As I said, homelessness and an experience of a shelter stay can be traumatic for some folks. Specifically at this time, congregate settings cannot be safe for a lot of people with underlying health conditions. During this current pandemic, we really try to keep as many folks from needing emergency shelter in that congregate setting as possible. And lastly, I think it's really, really important to note that shelters are a temporary fix, especially in Connecticut. Many of our shelters have a 90-day stay tops. And while there may be some exceptions for extensions, shelter is not housing. It's a temporary solution. And so we really try to work very, very hard as a state, as community partners, as housing service providers and homeless service providers, to come up with other solutions when people present at that first 211 call, at that first housing instability crisis. So we like to use this coordinated assessment analogy. This is an analogy of our triage, our coordinated entry workflow and systems. kind of similarly to an emergency room, right? So somebody that's in housing crisis, we relate that to somebody that might be in a health crisis. If you present yourself to an emergency room department and you walk into the waiting room, they're going to triage you and ask you what your crisis is, what's happening. If you present with a sprained ankle, that's very different than somebody presenting with heart pain, right? Chest compressions, and they need to see a cardiologist right away. So that person's going to come into the emergency room and be seen right away, versus somebody with a sprained ankle is going to have a little bit of wait time, and the level of services are very wide for those two instances. So we think of housing crisis in the same way, right? Somebody that's been literally homeless and sleeping on the street for quite some time is going to need a different level of service intervention than somebody who's maybe on the brink of homelessness and needs a little bit of financial assistance or some problem solving help to resolve their crisis quickly. So that brings us to how to do effective shelter diversion. And there are some really great techniques that we've worked out within the state, many other states use as well, to make sure that we're really servicing the clients in the best way that we can and treating everybody with some respect, regardless of their past history, of what they're going through at the moment. Creating a safe space for a client to talk is going to be the first step in really effective shelter diversion. So briefly introducing yourself. So if you've been working with a client for a while, if you've been working with somebody that you know is experiencing homelessness, they already have that trust level with you. But if you're meeting somebody for the first time who's presenting with stating to you that they are experiencing homelessness, what do you do? So you want to create a safe space. Let them know your name, your organization, your role, describe what the conversation is going to be like, ask them permission to talk about some very personal background history. We understand during this current pandemic that there are some difficulties here in creating that safe space. Having a phone call conversation versus an in-person appointment can make that a little bit more difficult, but the focus should really be on making the client feel comfortable and feel not judged. Within that context, we really try to make sure that our whole system in the state of Connecticut is trauma informed. So making sure that safety is always a factor, and that's not just physical safety, but emotional safety as well. Creating that trustworthiness so that a client feels comfortable with you to open up about their situation and what they think might be solutions to help come to a resolution. We really, really focus on client choice, prioritizing what the client feels is necessary, what next steps are necessary to resolve their crisis, and really focusing on working together in collaboration with the client so that there's a shared power of what the plan moving forward is going to be, and really including what the client feels is necessary for themselves. They are their own best advocates. Empowering and being skill building, really, really focusing on cultural responsiveness, respecting the LGBTQ community, understanding that we bring to the table our own past history and biases, and really focusing on making sure that we're culturally aware and trauma informed. At the root of diversion practices is a problem-solving conversation. And again, this may be a little redundant from previous trainings, but it's really important to focus on these problem-solving conversations, because they are the root of keeping folks from experiencing that literal homelessness or having to go to a shelter. So asking folks some of these beginning questions can start off the conversation. So where have you been sleeping? How long have you been sleeping there? Why can't you stay where you're at currently? getting a full scope of the history of homelessness that someone may have experienced. So someone may be presenting for the first time, or they may have come through our system a few times already. And so getting a full understanding of that background for the client can help you understand where to move forward. What resources they have, what natural resources, what family, what friends can help with a very temporary stay, or to come up with a more permanent housing solution moving forward. Another technique that is crucial in diversion practices is active and empathetic listening. What we want to do is make sure that the client that's presenting in front of us with a homeless episode feels heard. And so that client should be the one that's talking more, and we're listening as providers, as community partners, to really listen to the client, to understand what's happening on their end. Active and empathetic listening sounds like a really easy tool, but is something that can really be honed in on. And I encourage you to practice that, even at home with your family and friends, to take a step back and be quiet and let them talk. Can be a little bit harder than you would expect it to be. Again, cultural awareness, really checking our own biases. This is really important in the diversion practice. There's a quick implicit bias test that you can take. Here's the link. I encourage you all to do that. I've done it myself, and thinking that I'm a very open-minded person and very welcoming person, but found that I had my own implicit biases. So this is just another tool that you can use in your own skill set to be better prepared to help those that are in housing crisis. We want to make sure that we're taking the time to highlight strengths for clients, and this can be another technique that can be really helpful. What were things like for the client when things were going better, when they were stably housed? Who were the friends and family that they've maybe helped out in the past that could step in and help them now? And that we're really trying to make sure that clients feel not just dependent on their own and can sustain their housing situations on their own, but to find an interdependence, not just with family, friends, but other community partners, to give them the services that are needed to make sure that their strengths are highlighted and that housing solutions can be come up with very quickly. Motivational interviewing is some training that I would encourage you to attend. We do provide those motivational interviewing trainings from CCEh, but there are a wealth of other training resources on the web. The basics of motivational interviewing are to ask open-ended questions, right? So if you want to ask somebody if they're looking for a job, they're most likely going to say yes or no. If you ask somebody how their job search is going, tell me more about it, they're going to give you a whole lot more details. And getting a lot of those specifics about what someone's housing crisis looks like can give you the tools that you need to help that household resolve their crisis. We want to affirm positive behaviors, listen reflectively, and summarize what you're hearing from the client, really making sure that they're feeling heard. And again, this motivational interviewing training can be an ongoing skill set that can be honed in on, and I encourage you to attend further training here. Some motivational interviewing do's and don'ts is, again, explaining what the conversation is going to be about, asking permission, really focusing on understanding someone else's worldview, not giving advice, right? That's a difficult one to kind of wrap your head around, even especially for those of you that are in the field, that are providers, that have a lot of experience working with those experiencing homelessness. You may have in your toolkit, in your experience, some really easy scenarios that would work to help someone resolve their crisis, but folks are more likely to follow through on a plan if they've had an active role in coming up with that plan. So not trying to solve the problem for them, not speaking over somebody or cutting them off, really trying to be that active listener and helping them come up with a plan on their own. Responses to motivational interviewing: when it's done really well, a client's going to feel understood, accepted. They'll be willing to follow through on the plan that they've helped come up with. They will have feelings of hopefulness, and they'll feel engaged with you. When motivational interviewing is done poorly, the person in front of you, the person that you're trying to help, may feel judged. They may feel disrespected and less likely to follow what is your plan. They may shift backwards towards hopelessness. And lastly, and most importantly, they may disengage with you. They may put up a wall and say, this person's not really here to help me, and they will be less likely to call you for help in the action steps that they put forward to resolve their crisis. So in those problem-solving conversations, I think that it's really important, and I want to highlight this really quickly, is discussing some safety concerns with, especially with those that are presenting as what we call doubled up. So that may be anywhere from couch surfing to, you know, on a nightly basis, to staying with a family or friend for a very short period of time. And there are some questions that you can ask the person that you're trying to assist to find out a little bit more about their situation. Sleeping arrangements are important, because a doubled up situation might mean that somebody says, I can stay with my cousin for a month on their couch, and they'll allow that, and I can work on all the other steps that I need while I'm doing that. Or it might mean that they're sleeping on the floor of, you know, a family or a friend on a nightly basis and picking up the phone to call anybody that they can on a daily basis to see if they might be able to stay. The physical space is important. We talk about literal homelessness as being someone sleeping on the street, but it's important to recognize that that can also consist of somebody staying in a place that's not meant for human habitation. If a household is in an apartment without heat or running water or working plumbing, that those are all factors in having a place be habitable and appropriate for a household to stay. Infestation is something that, you know, we see often with folks that are having to leave where they're at the moment to find a new safe and appropriate place to stay. For families with young children, addressing those issues about drug and alcohol use in the homes that they might be staying in. Are there things that they may have to do, strings attached to staying with, you know, maybe it's not even a family or a friend member, but just an acquaintance that they're desperate to find a place to stay. So some of these issues are things that we can address, and making sure that when you ask these questions, you are really trying to stay trauma informed and reading the client's feedback and how they respond to those questions is important as well. So moving forward, after we've actively listened to the client, we've explored their past strengths, we want to really make sure that we're focusing on what housing options the household wants to pursue. So can they go back to live with friends and family? Do they need to return to their own residence? And maybe that might mean some landlord mediation. It might mean some mediation with friends and family to make sure that, you know, it's going to be a safe and stable place to go. Oftentimes we are temporarily diverting a household as we seek new housing. So that might be a very quick stay with an understanding that the client will be moving out into their own safe and stable home within a very short period of time. That could be as little as a couple of days to a couple of weeks to a month. And lastly, sometimes we do offer some assistance with relocating people out of town to a more safe and permanent place with natural resources. So we never want to send somebody from one homeless situation to another, but relocating to another safe place outside of town can be an option for folks as well. So this section really focuses a little bit more for providers on the diversion appointment and CAN intake. So that is after the initial 211 call, making sure that the appointment flows well for you. So I'm going to give you some information on how that works. Within the state of Connecticut, as I mentioned, we use our homeless management information system, that is HMIS, our database. That is where all of the appointment intakes happen. That is where the outcomes are shown, and where we track homeless history and episodes for each client. So that begins with a registration with 211. If you are a provider and you are in need of HMIS training, this is where you would go to register. Giving you a little brief snapshot here of the upcoming trainings that are available to folks. So hopefully that helps you out with some training options moving forward. The paperwork that is needed during an assessment, we really make sure that the client feels understood and ready to share their information. With that, we require a release of information form to be signed. Within the pandemic, I'll give you on the next slide a little bit of how we're working around that without paper copies, and a client being able to sit in front of you with the realization that many of these conversations are happening on the phone. In Connecticut, we have some templates for what we call an initial housing plan or a housing stabilization plan that the client can leave the appointment with and know what their next steps are, and know to be able to reference what was talked about, what services are available, what referrals might be appropriate moving forward to resolve their housing crisis. Again, I think it's really important when you're speaking with a client that you have a notepad readily available, and making sure that you're letting the client know that you're taking notes and asking permission to do so. The release of information should also be agency specific. So if you need some help with that, that should be like within your provider network, to make sure that the client knows they're signing to let other agencies know their personal information, and to let them know which agencies will be able to view that. Some best practices in conducting assessments for clients would be to make sure that you're taking, again, copious notes, making sure those case notes are entered into the database, and that they're entered as quickly as possible following a conversation with the client. This is what we're using in the state of Connecticut at the moment, or even since the pandemic began, in lieu of that release of information on paper. So due to the state's declaration of public health and civil preparedness emergency enacted by the governor, the client's verbal consent to enter personal identifiable information into HMIS will meet the standard of obtaining that paper copy. If the household then does enter emergency shelter, the emergency shelter caseworker will provide the written release of information. So what's important to think about within the HMIS workflow, if you're sitting down with a client and you've worked through all of the intake questions, you've come up with a housing stabilization plan, there are some appointment outcomes that you can choose from. And I think it's really important to kind of go over these and understand what each of them means. So a client might be diverted, and that is our goal in every instance. They should be either diverted temporarily or permanently. All right, so if, let's say, a young person presents and they've said that they need to leave their family home because mom or dad, they're not getting along, and you're able to do some mediation with the family, and mom and dad say, okay, great, we've resolved this crisis, and the client can continue to stay here as long as they need to. That is a permanent diversion. Temporary diversion can mean anything from one night with a family while you're working on a further housing stabilization plan and communication on the following day or the coming days to make sure that stability is found. to anywhere to a couple of weeks or a month with family or friends that might be able to help. And that can be piecemeal between natural resources. So somebody might be couch surfing and bouncing around, but that can still be a diversion. And those diversions should be an outcome that is marked in our database immediately following the client initial intake. If diversion is not possible, there are a couple of options that can happen for a client. They may be added to what we call a priority wait list for emergency shelter. We try to make sure that those that are the most vulnerable and the most in need get access to shelter before others. So somebody that has experienced a lengthy stay, sleeping out on the street, may take priority from somebody that is on the brink of homelessness and may have some other options available to them. So we prioritize our wait lists. Oftentimes the shelters are full, we don't have beds available, and this is our only option. When someone is added to a priority wait list, we would expect that a referral to an outreach worker would also happen simultaneously so that the client does not slip through the cracks, that they are able to have a seamless flow of services available to them in order to, again, make sure that any episode of homelessness is as brief as possible. If there are shelter beds available or a shelter bed for an individual or family, the client may be marked as accepted for enrollment. And what that means is that they are leaving the intake with you or phone call with you and going immediately to an emergency shelter where a bed is available. And that should be the only time that accepted for enrollment is used as an outcome for the appointment. Sometimes you will find that there are clients that are sleeping out on the street that do not want to enter emergency shelter. There are various reasons for this to happen. Again, there are rules and regulations at shelters oftentimes. If somebody has a pet that is not specifically a service animal, we do need to make accommodations for those, but that would be an instance where they wouldn't want to leave their animal in order to enter an emergency shelter and prefer to stay in a place not meant for human habitation because of that. Someone that maybe works third shift that cannot go to an emergency shelter overnight may have other options of sleeping in a car during the day. So refused shelter is another option that you might choose, but would be one that we would hope would be more of a rare instance. Lastly, there is an option for what we call not currently appropriate. And again, this would be an option that you would, all other options have been exhausted. The client's not refusing shelter. We recognize that, on a case-by-case basis, every individual has a unique circumstance. And there may be some things that come up that don't fit the bill for these other categories. So not currently appropriate should really be used in very rare instances. Again, case notes are really important. And why are they really important? Because you're not the only one that's viewing them. You're not the only one that's in the client record in our database. All of the service providers across the state can view our HMIS database. And so it's important to make sure that, the conversation that you're having with the client in making sure that your housing stabilization plan is in place, that next steps are happening, is great. But let's say you resign next week. Who's going to take up the caseload? Who's going to take up where you left off? Or if you are a case manager at a shelter, you want to make sure that your case notes are really comprehensive so that if the client leaves shelter and then reaches an outreach worker, they know where to pick up as well. So where the client has been sleeping, for how long, what options they've explored, the outcome of the assessment, and what other referrals were offered during the appointment are all really important things to include in your case notes. Best practices in writing case notes in HMIS would be that the case notes are input into the database immediately following the diversion appointment. Now, I can speak from experience in having had years of doing CAN assessments, working in direct client service, I recognize that this is not always the easiest thing to do. When you have an appointment schedule of maybe 5 to 10 people that you're seeing on any given day, it's easy to close out one appointment and get ready for the next. And leave those case notes for the end of the day, or maybe, you know, once or twice a week. But I encourage you really as a best practice to make sure that those case notes get input as quickly and as soon as possible following the conversation, so that you can really make sure that you're as comprehensive as possible, including as many details as possible. That there's a CAN case note template that you can find in HMIS. You want to make sure that you can include all household income and sources, the full household composition, including all adults and children, and be as thorough as possible while only stating facts. So being objective rather than subjective is really important. I'm going to give you a couple previews of some case notes just so you have a little reference here. So a really good case note's going to give lots of information, and it's going to be about a paragraph long, not just a couple of sentences. Again, you want to make sure that you're including everything that was talked about, what disabilities the client is facing, what barriers they have to housing, and what referrals have been made during the appointment. I like to use this one as an example of what doesn't work in a case note, and really being mindful of other people being able to view the client record as a total. So this particular case note, and I've excluded the information on who entered it into HMIS. Says the client reported sleeping on the greens in Milford. He was made aware that he has missed all his previous CAN appointments. Seems like something may be off with him. Now, I wouldn't expect this of many providers across the field who do really exceptional work and work really well with clients and provide that level of service that's needed. But just to really make sure that we are mindful that what we write about a client stays with them, much like a doctor's appointment and then their medical record. So just really being mindful of what you write in HMIS, stating clear facts and being objective is crucial and really important to maintaining the client experience, maintaining their dignity and respect, which is should be at the forefront of really how we're providing services to those that are in crisis. So thinking about a housing stabilization plan is really important, and you should have this in place for every client that you meet, especially as providers. For those of you that are not providers in the field but are just learning a little bit about diversion, this can be a template and a tool for you as well, to help and assist those that are experiencing homelessness. So we really try to maintain a housing first focus. If you're not familiar with housing first practices, we do also have some training available on our website for that. But really to focus that putting a roof over somebody's head is the first step in addressing any of the other problems or crises that they have in their life. Without an address, without a place to shower and have readily accessible hygiene. All of those things are really important, so we really try to maintain housing first. So somebody may have substance abuse issues, they may have a slew of disabilities, but we're going to put a roof over their head first. Exploring all natural resources, making sure that the client is very aware of what action steps were talked about, thinking about how to gain or increase income is oftentimes really important in putting together a housing stabilization plan. We want to think about what housing options have already been explored prior to the client even meeting you, thinking about their SMART goals, and making sure that all of this documentation of everything that you've done with the client, that the housing stabilization plan has been uploaded to HMIS for review for anybody else that may encounter the client in the future and need to pick up on working through their next steps with them. This brings me back to the beginning of our presentation when we talked about the HUD definitions of homelessness and why they're important, because there are different levels of services available to folks that are in housing crisis, and the eligibility requirements may mean that you have some documentation to pull together on your end in working with the client. If they are experiencing literal homelessness, they should again be referred to a homeless outreach worker who can then provide that documentation, proof of a literal homelessness, and that documentation should be uploaded to the client's file. That can mean the difference between a client being eligible for a rapid rehousing program or not being eligible. And so making sure that when you're working with clients that are in that situation, that are in a place that's not meant for human habitation, that you're providing as much detail. Oftentimes we even look to third-party soup kitchens, clothing closets, people that provide basic needs in the community that are familiar with the client that you're working with to help out in that documentation of literal homelessness. And again, that is to ensure that they are eligible for whatever services might be in the community to help them out, especially within our homeless response system. A little bit trickier when you're working with somebody who may be imminently homeless and that is about to lose their housing within 14 days. So that might be that family and friends have been threatening to kick them out and they're really at that breaking point. So how do we do that due diligence to make sure that we're documenting imminent homelessness? So that can be anything from what we call like a love letter from a family member or a friend that they've been staying with, to eviction paperwork, whatever documentation you can pull together to show that this client is really and truly on the brink of homelessness and in dire need of those services to resolve that crisis. Again, those documentations should all be uploaded into HMIS. So we want to dive in a little bit, and this is what makes this training a little bit different from our 1.0, to kind of work through some scenarios of typical, and again, case by case, everybody's going to be unique. Everybody's going to be individual and present with their own circumstances. But there are some scenarios that we see that are kind of common. So we're going to work through, I will be reading through some scenarios that we have based on actual clients that have come through our system. What I'd like you to think about as I'm reading these scenarios is helping to identify the strengths the person might have, thinking about what clarifying questions you would want to ask the client to help them resolve their situation. And then lastly, to develop some potential outcomes or plans for this person based on the information that they've shared. And really keeping in mind that, in this virtual setting, it's a little bit different, but keeping in mind that in actual practice, when you're working with clients, that you're really focusing on taking into account the client choice. And if you wouldn't mind, as I'm reading through this and you're identifying strengths, clarifying questions, and possible outcomes, if you just type in the chat box what you're thinking about as some of those strengths, some of those questions, and some of those outcomes. So this scenario 1, and I'll just read through. I'll let you read with me on the screen. Stacy is in her mid-30s and has one daughter aged 8. She and her daughter have lived with her mom for 3 years. Stacy's on the lease and pays rent. Mom tossed her out after she last relapsed 2 nights ago, after she had been clean from heroin for 9 months. Stacy had been active in NA for most of that time, but stopped going to meetings 3 weeks ago. Her relapse only lasted a couple of days. She doesn't believe she needs detox, but her mom could tell and won't let her back in the home. Stacy began using with her ex, who's her daughter's other parent, and she had several bouts of active use and recovery. The ex is remarried, lives in the area, but is always too busy with the new family to spend much time or energy with his daughter. Stacy's daughter is still staying with her grandmother, and grandma isn't allowing Stacy to see her. She thinks she may have even called DCF on her. Stacy's work hours were cut due to COVID because she repeatedly missed work during the relapse and she was already on probation. However, she feels she was good at her job and is willing to talk to her boss. She's angry with her mom, mad at herself, frustrated, wants help, but doesn't want to start recovery all over. Stacy hasn't had anywhere to go since mom kicked her out and reports sleeping in the hallway of her mother's building. So I'll turn that to Amber to let us know if we have anybody that's responded with what are some strengths that Stacy has.
Well, one strength that someone identified is that Stacy has been clean for 9 months prior. And I'm waiting for other strengths to come in. So please, folks, enter in the questions box. I don't think you all have access to the chat box.
Great, thank you, Amber. Yes, Stacy's been clean for 9 months. I mean, she's worked really hard at that. So making sure that when you're having these conversations about what this crisis looks like for Stacy, identifying that as a strength and really motivating her in that way can be useful in talking about housing.
Yes, okay. We have several that came through. So Stacy is willing to go back and talk to her boss. Let's see, she pays her rent. She's good at her job and willing to talk to her boss again. She seems to be motivated to work. Her mom is willing to speak to her employer so that she can maintain her employment. She also is confident in her abilities at work. She's on a lease, and there can be some means to mediate that. She has the support of her family. She has the strength. She has money. So yes, there's several strengths that Stacy has.
That's
and also,
great.
her mom is keeping her daughter while she can get herself together.
Yeah, absolutely. Stacy's got quite a few strengths and a lot of things here that can lead to some next steps for her, right? It could be that the next day she has an appointment that she can make with her boss to talk, that she's actively in conversation with her mom about re-entering the home. All of those are really important strengths to highlight for Stacy. Any clarifying questions that you would want to ask?
We're giving people time to enter their questions, but I will say some other strengths that we did not mention is that she has a history of actively being involved in NA. And just the fact that she is not hopeless, she has not given up on herself yet. And she didn't return to the streets or use substances. Some clarifying questions that came through is asking Stacy what would she like to work on at this time? Would she consider going back to NA? Is there any way that she can stay with other family or friends? Would she be willing to live in a sober house?
Lots of great questions there. Yeah. Thinking about the child's father, the scenario states that, Stacy's presenting and saying that he's not involved. Are there other clarifying questions that could be asked to help resolve the situation regarding the ex-husband or ex-boyfriend here?
We can also explore, what her triggers were that led to her relapse. If she's open to receiving any type of therapy, can they mediate with her child's father, as you just mentioned?
Is he paying child support is another question. It sounds like she's been paying her rent, but are there ways that she can increase her income so that she can afford a rental on her own without having to live with mom? So lots of things here. Other potential outcomes that might be a successful diversion in this case.
For temporary diversion options, I have some folks asking about her going to a rehab program.
Sure. We do try to remain housing focused, and that would have to be Stacy's choice, and something that she is actively searching on her own. But yes, absolutely, those options can be explored as well. Great, and if we don't have anything else coming in, then we'll move on to scenario 2, and we've got 2 more to go through.
Okay. Last 2 that came through is just engaging the ex and seeing how they can work together for the child and to resolve the crisis that they're in, and also speaking to the mother to see what options she may have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really valid and useful to point out that maybe mom doesn't know that Stacy's been sleeping in the hallway. Maybe the ex that is limitedly involved with the daughter doesn't understand the level of crisis that she's in, or know again that she's sleeping in a hallway. And if those family or friends had a full understanding, they may be more willing to help out. Great, so scenario 2. Catherine and her 5-year-old daughter were displaced from the apartment that she was renting for the last 3 years following a fire in the building last week. Red Cross provided a $500 gift card, which she has used to pay for a hotel stay and has exhausted. Catherine was in the apartment at the time of the fire, and during the call you can hear that her voice is trembling as she describes the experience. Catherine has full-time employment at the local post office, but has not been back to work since the fire, nor has her daughter attended virtual school due to losing her laptop in the fire. Catherine tells you that her only family is a sister that lives in the state, but she's an hour commute away from her. Her sister is willing to help, but doesn't know how. Catherine has been calling her landlord, but has not gotten any response back. So again, thinking about what are Catherine's strengths, what are some clarifying questions that you would want to ask Catherine, and what do you see as some possible diversion outcomes in a scenario like this? And we'll give you all a few minutes to type in your responses.
Okay. So some strengths that came through is that Catherine has a history of full-time employment.
Great. Yes.
She's also engaged with her issues. She realizes that they are there. She is
self-realization, yes.
She utilized the $500 that she received appropriately. Also, she has support of her family. Her sister is willing to help. She also had rental insurance, which is really important and helpful. She keeps contacting her landlord, so she is making attempts.
Any clarifying questions that you would want to ask Catherine? And I would point specifically to employment and her daughter's school.
As the questions come through, I'll also point out that, her daughter is in virtual school, which during this time, we see so many children that are actually not attending virtual school. So that is definitely a strength that she has. Some clarifying questions that came through is just where's the father? Is he involved at all? Can he be of assistance? Also, has she spoken to her employer or her daughter's school about what is going on? Is it possible for her daughter to get another computer from the school? And does she have any means for transportation?
All great questions. We're going to talk a little bit after the scenarios, and I'm mindful of the time here, so I want to move on. But knowing what resources are available to you in your community and what referrals you can make an impact on what your housing stabilization plan looks like with the client. Within the school system, there are some levels of supports that can be offered. specifically under a federal law called McKinney-Vento. And each school district is tasked at having a McKinney-Vento liaison available to parents. So that would be a referral that could be made for Catherine and her daughter to make sure that she's attending school. There are other services, including transportation back and forth to school, that can be provided under that. The municipality where Catherine is living, based on the fire happening in the building, whether or not the building had been deemed uninhabitable, or condemned, might mean that there are some further services that the city can provide to her as well, especially if the landlord is not responding. So just some things to point out there. And we'll move on to scenario 3. Okay, so Fred and Joy are a married couple that have been sleeping in their car for the last 5 months. They recently relocated from Maine after his father died, and most of the family went their separate ways. Joy has a high school friend that she reconnected with on Facebook. She lives in Connecticut, and when she heard of the couple's circumstances, invited them to come and stay with her. However, upon arrival, the couple realized her living conditions were not healthy. There was mold and evidence of infestation in her small apartment, so the couple decided it was better to sleep in the car. They use a rest stop on occasion for showers. Joy suffers from bipolar disorder and is on disability benefits, receiving $771 a month. Fred has had multiple injuries to his back and was in a serious motorcycle accident years ago with an injury to his head. He has trouble remembering small details and gets confused easily while answering assessment questions. Fred is applying for disability benefits as well. He's already applied 2 times and has been denied. He's in the appeal process. Both self-report during the appointment that they have swollen legs and complaining of pain in their ankles and feet, making it difficult to get around. They are concerned about going to a friend's home in Connecticut as well as traveling because of COVID and their medical conditions. So we won't take too much time, but if you had some, again, what are their strengths? What are the questions you would want to ask to help inform next steps? And what would be some possible diversion outcomes? And we'll give that about 5 minutes.
Okay, so some strengths are that for one, they have each other. Also, they are still taking care of their hygiene by stopping at rest stops and showering. Joyce has income. They have people that are willing to help them. They seem to have a strong relationship. And that's the majority of their strengths.
Great. How about some clarifying questions?
Also, I didn't mention a strength is they have a vehicle. They have a vehicle, to get around as well as to stay in.
Absolutely. Transportation is important.
All right, clarifying question. Where were they living in Maine? Get some more information about the Maine situation.
Absolutely. Who were they staying with? If they were staying with someone, did they have their own lease? What happened with the family? Why did they go separate ways when the father died? Are there family mediation tools that can be used here to help resolve that situation? Excellent.
As well as finding out additional information about Joy, and is she currently taking her medication?
Excellent. Fred's disability benefits, any questions there that you would want to ask?
Right. Yeah, as well as finding out why. Why was his disability previously denied? Have they taken any steps to, see what's going on with that?
Excellent. Yeah, for those of you in the field that have any experience in working on the applications for disability benefits, know that it can take quite a long time. And if you want to know whether or not Fred is working directly and closely with a medical doctor that he trusts. Does he have a lawyer on his side that's reviewed the case in his appeal? those things can help to expedite the appeal process. So those would be some other questions that I, personally would want to ask. Anything about this swollen legs and ankles?
Actually, no, that was not listed.
Thanks, Amber. So the reason that I put that into this scenario, and again, these are cases that are based off of real clients that have come through our system, and in my experience in direct client service, those folks that have been sleeping in a car for an extended period of time will present with that same swollen leg scenario. It's not healthy for the human body to sleep sitting up on a nightly basis. So some folks get creative and maybe put a mattress in the back of a vehicle and can lay flat, but oftentimes the uncomfortableness can lead to some medical issues that can certainly hinder someone focusing on their housing rather than their physical pain. So that is another thing that could be addressed there. And we'll move on because I want to make sure that we do have some time for some questions at the end of today's training. So emergency assistance, that would be financial assistance that could be available to the client that is in housing crisis. At CCEh, at the beginning of the presentation today, I did mention that we do have some financial assistance that can be available to the providers within our state. And we work really hard to fill the gaps on what those assistance levels can be for any household that is either literally homeless or on the brink. So we have what we call our Be Homeful campaign, and that started out years ago as one-time financial assistance for families, and that very often is help with security deposit or rental assistance, but is very flexible and meant to be flexible for that reason, that we encourage that creative problem solving, and oftentimes somewhere upwards of about $1,000 to $2,000 could be all that's needed to prevent an episode of homelessness. When Hurricane Maria hit and we had an inflow of people coming into the state needing assistance, we worked really hard to come up with some donations and funding to help those folks. Another instance of some financial assistance that's available through CCEh is what we call our Children in Shelters program. So for those families that are not able to be diverted, have entered shelter and are in need of some assistance with childcare, there's some funding available there. Our Youth Diversion and Rapid Exit program is our YHDP Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. That is financial assistance specific to those experiencing homelessness that fall under the age range of 18 to 24. And if you'd like to learn more about our financial assistance available to families and how we solicit donations, how we work through assisting those families in the best manner possible, you can go to www.behomeful.org to learn more about our Paddington Bears, our spokesperson. For those of you that are providers in the field in Connecticut and you'd like to access funding for the clients that you're working with, there are a few things that would need to be in place. Your agency would have to have a signed MOU, that is a memorandum of understanding with CCEh. The staff completing the request must have attended CCEh diversion training. You would need access to a form that we use in Smartsheets to request funding for your client. On that form, there's a spot for you to include the story of what the client is experiencing, how the financial assistance will assist your client to resolve the crisis quickly, and that story is really important in submitting requests. You would also, excuse me, I forgot to put on that slide, my apologies, but you would also need access to our HMIS database and have been trained in that. Allowable expenses, typically for programs to assist in financial assistance would be security deposits, rental assistance, sometimes rental arrearages, keeping in mind that we're using those guidelines of imminent homelessness to define eligibility. So somebody that may be behind on back rent, but is not in an eviction process. There's some gray area there. So those are some things that to keep in mind. The eligibility for diversion financial assistance is that somebody does fall into that category of imminent homelessness. So some other expenses that we're able to help out with on occasion, if a pet is a barrier, you know, like I said, we've really worked hard to fill the gaps on what financial assistance can be available to folks. And one of the really unique and really innovative things that we've been able to work through in Connecticut is a grant from PetSmart. So when a pet is a barrier to housing, there are some options to assist with pet expenses as long as it's housing focused and we're resolving the housing crisis. And we really encourage our providers to think outside the box. So it could be that, you know, the client themselves doesn't have any income at all, but the friends and family that they've been staying with are struggling with a utility bill or something along those lines. Sometimes those are some of the unique and really creative ways that we can help with financial assistance to resolve a housing crisis. That brings us to the final of our presentation today, and that is resource mapping within your community. So while we remain housing focused, our #1 priority is to put a roof over somebody's head, to put a plan in place with next steps for housing stability. But we're not housing only, we're housing first. So what other referrals can you make for your client? What information, what contact information can you provide them to assist in other areas that might help with the housing stability plan? So doing the work on the front end at your agency or where you are within your community to know the full scope of services that are available in real time for the clients that you're servicing. So things like job centers, childcare actions, having a Care for Kids application readily available to give to the client, knowing where substance abuse treatment centers are and how to access them, what referral processes need to be in place if somebody presents to you and says, today's the day, I've been using substances, but you know, I want help. Really making sure that you know where to turn to ahead of time before a situation like that would present to you can be really beneficial. So also knowing where to locate your city fair housing officer. They can help with landlord mediation, tenant rights, really understanding what's needed to mediate there. Adult education services, veteran services, elderly protective services, knowing where to send your client for basic needs, such as where to go for a shower, if that's an option in your community, knowing where clothing closets are, soup kitchens. Again, based on one of the scenarios, knowing who your local McKinney-Vento contact is and how to reach that person to assist within the school system. And this is just a small list of what resources might be available in your community, but there are other ways for you to have a full and extensive list of resources that you can refer your clients to. Another way to pull together that really full comprehensive list is to reach out to some of your other community partners. So you may have what's called a community services office or a human services office within your municipality. Knowing where that office is and how to contact them. Your local public library can be overlooked often, but can be a great resource, as many folks that are experiencing literal homelessness, especially in cold weather times or really, really hot weather times, are looking for a space to go to stay hot or cool, and a library is often a place that they can do so. Department of Social Services, where they can go to apply for things like SNAP benefits, disability benefits, all of those applications, and knowing where to go. Your community action agency, again, can also be a place for utility assistance and things like that. Pre-pandemic, all of these offices have waiting rooms with bulletin boards where folks in the community regularly go to post things. So it's a great place to go for really timely information. So resource considerations, again, we want to make sure that we're staying housing focused, but not housing only, exploring additional resource options, making sure that any referrals that you are giving to your client are appropriate and we're taking into account client choice, and really making sure that you have a full and comprehensive list of what resources are available, the contact information, if there are applications involved, having those readily available for your clients, and oftentimes in assisting them in filling them out too. 211 in Connecticut, while it is the go-to hotline for anybody experiencing homelessness, they have a wealth of resources aside from housing services. So if you're looking for region-specific services that you are unaware of in your community, this is a great search engine to go back to, and also a really useful tool for clients to be able to navigate on their own. So making sure that your connection to resources in the community is always trauma-informed care, that it's not simply providing contact information, but as I said, maybe it's assisting somebody in filling out an application that they're having trouble with. But knowing your client and knowing what they may need some more assistance with is important. So they may need you to hop on a three-way call with them because they have trouble with navigating other community partners. Transportation to a resource can be important, providing reminders for an appointment or a follow-up, making sure that they know how to navigate other systems as well, and being that resource person to assist them can be really crucial. I like to use this Google Maps search engine as just like an example of a really practical solution, a practical way to assist your client after leaving the appointment. It's just an example. There are many easy things that you can do to point your client in the right direction, and not just giving them, here's a phone number to call, but say they need to go to their local DSS office in person because they have some issues with an application for SNAP benefits, for instance. Not just giving them the address to go to, but making sure that they have every practical piece of information that they need to follow through on that next step. So, Google Maps is really easy. You can do transportation, put in, the starting point and the exit destination of where the client is trying to go, and giving them, that real practical information of not just here's what I need to do, but here are the steps that I need to take to follow through on that. And I want to end this before we have a couple of minutes just for some questions, to recognize that diversion is not always going to be possible. There are going to be instances where you've worked really, really hard with a client, you've had maybe multiple conversations with them, you've explored as many natural resources as possible, and the client is just telling you they don't have anything, they don't have anyone, they've burnt bridges maybe, and they're really stuck and they're needing some help. So in those instances, I really want to make sure that we are not letting those clients slip through the cracks, that we are connecting them to their local outreach worker, making sure that they've been added to a priority wait list if they are needing emergency shelter. And it's really important that they leave the conversation with you knowing that they can reach back out for services, and how do they stay in contact with us. So making sure that the client contact information is accurate. If they don't have a cell phone, which is common among the transient population that is literally homeless, losing phones, having phones stolen can happen. So if the client has an email, that's a question that we would want to be asking. And if they don't, another practical piece of information that we can help them with is creating a free email account, and then giving them a way to check in with you so that you give them multiple ways to contact you If you have a work cell phone or you're comfortable and your agency allows it, to provide a cell phone number for text options, walk-in options, which are limited during the pandemic, but making sure that the client leaves the conversation with you and feeling that they have a way to connect back, and not the only way would be to call 211 again. And I recognize we only have a few minutes for questions, but welcome them, and we'll do our best to answer them. If we don't get to any questions, we'll certainly can follow up after this webinar. You have my contact information here. You can also contact training@cceh.org with questions that we would be happy to answer to assist you in helping best those people that are experiencing homelessness.
All right, great. Thank you, Diana, so much for your presentation. We do have a couple of questions that came through. I'll start with one that we always get for those of you that may have joined late. Yes, this training was being recorded, and the recording as well as the slides will be emailed to you all following this training, and it will also be in our webinar library on our website at www.cceh.org. So a few questions came through. Let me just find one. For example, what would you do in a situation if a client is in the shelter and maybe after 90 days or so, they don't have anywhere to stay? Can they be extended? Would you discharge them to homelessness? I mean, what would you do in that situation?
I think that there are some rare instances where a client would unfortunately be discharged back to homelessness, but we work really hard to make sure that that never happens. So if you're working with a client, you are outside of the shelter system and the client is telling you they've been in shelter for 90 days, the first thing that I would want to do is verify that with a shelter case manager. And what might need to happen in that circumstance would be to have the client that you're working with sign a release of information, so that the three of you can speak openly about how long the client's been there, what action steps have been taken while the client has been there. You know, if there are further barriers that have happened that would eliminate the client from coming up with a solution within those 90 days, but certainly extensions do happen as well when needed.
Okay. And let's say if someone is in an emergency type of situation and the shelter is full, is there anything else that can be done for the client?
That's a really difficult conversation to have with somebody sitting in front of you that's in crisis, to say, I don't have immediate solutions. Unfortunately, that does happen, and there have to be ways that we can speak with the client to still provide them with a sense of hope, to still provide them with a sense that there are other services that we can help refer and provide them with in order to come up with a solution for their housing crisis. Emergency shelter should never be the go-to, right? We want to work on other options as well. So to say to somebody, I know that you are in crisis, I know that, you know, this is really difficult what you're going through, we don't have a shelter bed today, but let's get you in touch with an outreach worker if you're sleeping you know, in your car or out on the street in an abandoned building maybe, to make sure that you don't fall through the system, that we continue to be engaged with you and help you come up with options. And there may be some other further interventions that are available to that person if you've documented their literal homelessness, for some financial assistance, for some housing search navigation maybe, to help assist that client as well.
All right, thank you. Let's see, we have a few questions that came through. So we have different providers and different people from different organizations on the call, and some are asking, how will they get connected to HMIS? Is it available for anyone, or is there any particular, you know, only program for providers that can have access?
Yeah, HMIS is not specific to just Connecticut. It's used nationwide. I would, if you can give us a little more information about where you're located, shoot us an email after this webinar. We can try to get you in contact with the provider in your state or region that can assist you.
Yes. Okay, and for those that would like to access our emergency assistance but are not sure if their organization has an MOU with us, what can they do?
Again, shoot me an email. You have my email on the screen right here. Let me know what provider you work for, where you're located in Connecticut, and I can let you know whether or not an existing MOU is in place and if your agency would qualify to have an MOU signed, then we can work towards that as well.
Okay. And I'm going to ask you one last question. We know shelter diversion is such a important practice, but there's many people that can utilize it. You know, can you give a little bit of insight as far as like what can a navigator do to assist with shelter diversion?
Yeah, the word navigator, the job title navigator, can mean a couple of different things. It might mean that you're an outreach worker. It might mean that you conduct the initial CAN intake diversion appointments. So I would like to know a little bit more about what the navigator role specific to you would mean.
Providing outreach. What can an outreach provider do to assist with shelter diversion?
Yeah, the focus should always be on that problem solving conversation. So I think that, you know, there's a misconception, I think sometimes in our field, that an outreach worker's job is to get people into emergency shelter. And really it should be focused on the things that we've talked about in this presentation. What are the client's natural resources, exploring all other options besides shelter, and really creating that trustworthiness between yourself and the client that is literally homeless is crucial in helping them come up with a housing stabilization plan, which should still be part of your job description and responsibilities.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much. Yeah, diversion can be done in every area. You know, a lot of people, as Diana said, think of it as only shelter providers or only for intake, but we want to have those conversations prior to even getting to that step. So if you're an outreach provider, if you're a navigator, if you're in a school system or a community provider, you can still have problem-solving conversations to really find out what an individual is experiencing and try to help them with that crisis. So I do not see any other questions that came through, but thank you all so much for joining us today. If there are any additional questions, please feel free. You can contact me at training@cceh.org, and then you also have Diana's information if you need to ask her a very specific shelter diversion question. If there's other questions related to your training needs, you can also reach out to me. And the training as well as the slides will be available. So thank you all for joining. Diana, as always, thanks for giving a good presentation, a great presentation, I'm sorry. And you all take care. Thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone.